In this passage, one of the challenges we can face as believers coming to it afresh is that we sort of come with maybe a church context or a theological background or a particular way of thinking that informs it almost before we come to it. And I've been quite challenged and encouraged as I've looked at it afresh, and I looked at a variety of perspectives, and there are many, on this passage, and trying to get to grips with what is Jesus saying here. And people talk about when are these events that Jesus is talking about in Mark 13? When do they happen? How do they happen? What does this verse mean? What does that particular detail mean? So just at the start, to get a picture of what I think is going on in these verses, I think in the first section from 1 down to 23, like many scholars, though not all, I'm almost called myself a scholar there, like the scholars, in verses 1 down to 23, that the events described here are largely describing what happened around the time of AD 70 and the siege of Jerusalem as they rebelled against the Roman Empire. I also think that Jesus is painting a microcosm of a picture of what will happen at the end. So there's a sense in which this is a small picture of what we might see when Christ returns. Not exactly the same in all the details and all the stuff and these kinds of things, but there are certain other New Testament references that make me think that primarily he's answering a question to Peter and James and John and Andrew. So he's talking to them, so he's talking about something that you will see, that will happen to you. But he might also just be casting a picture, casting a vision of what might happen at the end. Also, this would be called the combination view, which is what a lot of people think. Some people think it's referring to AD 70. Others think it's only referring to the end of time. And there's others who think maybe there's primarily an AD 70 thing, but a bit of like looking forward as well and thinking about that too. But my primary thinking is that verses 1 to 23 are largely referring to the here and now. And then the following verses are certainly from verses 32 down to 37 are looking at when Christ comes himself. It's like he's talking about this day that's going to happen soon, and then there's going to be that day right at the end. So there's a bit of both going here. But hopefully that makes a little more sense as we go through. But as you go through these verses, the danger I think that can happen is you can almost miss the wood for the trees a little bit and not ask the question, why is Jesus telling us, the disciples, these things? What is the point of telling them these things? And my fear is that I don't want to get caught up too much in the details, that there's like no application. This isn't just a kind of interesting study, but it's like, why is Jesus telling us? How does this help us live the Christian life? How does this help us follow him? Both for the disciples then and for us now. And so the two phrases that come up in this first section, that's largely what I want us to be left with this morning. One that comes up a couple of times is be on your guard. And yet the other one is do not be alarmed. Which is kind of the Christian life in some ways, isn't it? There's a sense in which we fight as soldiers and we're on our guard against certain things, and we're watchful and we're vigilant and we're diligent and dutiful. And at the same time, it's like, don't be alarmed. We're concerned about things out here and spiritual challenges and all kinds of things, but at the same time, we're not alarmed. Although we get alarmed. He says, do not be alarmed, because Jesus is in control. And Jesus knows what's happening. He's predicting events that haven't even happened yet. And he knows they're going to happen. It's his way of saying, don't be alarmed, because I know it's all going to come. What matters is that you listen to me and my words. There's going to be a lot of people telling you a lot of things. There's going to be a lot of things happening that are going to seem that are catastrophic, with no arguments there. But listen to me and to my words. Be on your guard. Don't be alarmed. I am on the throne. If we come away with that this morning, then I'll be a happy chappy, because that's important for Christians to know that when they come away that week. To come away from Sunday knowing that. Be on your guard. Don't be alarmed. Jesus reigns and will rule forever. So let's look at the passage together. Mark 13, it's probably helpful if you've got some form of Bible open in front of you as we go through it. But Mark 13, verses 1 to 2, this passage more or less begins with a question. And then Jerusalem, 13 verse 1 says, as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, look, teacher, what wonderful stones and wonderful buildings, which they were. I mean, the architecture around that time was apparently very, very impressive. incredible. We've all been to cities where we wander around, Rome, Vienna, wherever it might be, and you think, wow, look at these amazing buildings, look at these amazing things. This is what the disciples, these boys are looking around and thinking, this is fantastic. And Jesus said to them, do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Bit of a taking the wind out of the sails there and looking at these wonderful buildings, and Jesus makes this pretty ominous statement about it's all going to come down. There'll be a time when it will all be gone. It'll be crumbled, but not one stone upon another. Be thrown down. So verse 3, we read, as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple of God, this wonderful structure and building, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? It seems they have some sense of an end time, a judgment, or something that's going to happen, and that there should be things that they should see that show you that's going to happen. There's some kind of sign. What's that going to be? When's that going to happen? And Jesus warns them about certain things that are going to come. He warns them and tries to shape their thinking around this event, whatever it's going to be. Jesus began to say to them, the first thing he says before this, what he's described in verse 3, verses 4 and onwards, is that there's going to be a lot of false messiahs. There's going to be a lot of false people who are going to come and claim that this is all happening. Possibly they're the Messiah. We read that in verse 5. Jesus began to say to them, see that no one leads you astray. There's always that danger with God's people. They can be led astray by certain things, certain doctrines, certain people. Verse 6, many will come in my name, saying, I am he. And they will lead many astray. So he's warning them so that you don't be led astray, because they're going to come, they're going to lead people astray. False messiahs, false saviors, they will come. Apparently in Jesus' day, following even his resurrection and on the build-up to the events of AD 66 to 70, there was a ton of false messiahs. There was a ton of people that would come and say, I am he, I am he. I even read that Josephus at one point said it was almost like they were being arrested on a daily basis, because they would come and they would say, I am he, and they'd lead people, or they'd try and lead an uprising or a revolt or an attack, and they just get arrested and chucked in prison. And so this was a common parlance in Jesus' day, and for the disciples, they would be looking at all these guys and going, do you remember when, or the Christians say, remember when Jesus said, careful of all these guys, many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. That's the phrase I love there. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, this around that time, and again on the build up to these events, if you're agree with me in that. And by the way, you may well disagree with me, and that's okay. You can still be friends. It's all right. But if I see you wincing, I'll know you disagree. That's fine. Okay, don't worry about it. But if you're taking this kind of AD 70, mostly happening in and about there view, there was a ton of wars built up there. You read the historical records written by Josephus, who's our best historian for that time, for that era, a Jewish fellow that some people believe maybe became a Christian later on because of some of the way he wrote, possibly, who knows, hopefully. But he recorded many wars, and that there was wars happening all around the Roman Empire. Even over here at points, we're always fighting about something, aren't we? So there was something going on. There was just wars everywhere. And rumours of wars. There was always the expectation that, are they going to attack us, or the Romans, or what's going to happen here? They were well familiar, if you like, with war. He says, this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. So we've got false messiahs, we've got wars and rumors of wars, people fighting one another. Also, in verse 8, there will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains, meaning that it's not yet. It's not happening yet. That's what we have there as well. And again, historically recorded, those things happened. Earthquakes, famines. We often hear of that today, but you read about all those things centuries ago. They were happening. And even in the book of Acts, in Acts 11, you read about the famine that came under the time of Claudius, and they say it was around the whole world, and it was this big famine that happened around the empire. These things happened on the build-up to these events. And these things this seems to be our history cycles, doesn't it? Because this is not unfamiliar to us, is it? History goes this way. False messiahs abound. We just have more access to them now. I think online false prophets, false people who speak false things and seek to lead people astray from the words of Jesus. Wars and rumours of wars. Again, I appreciate Brian's words, and speaking in the prayers there, we turn on the TV, go online. There's a war happening here. There's a war happening over there. There's rumours of, maybe more. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. You read of natural disasters, floods, fires, earthquakes, stuff everywhere. It seems to be how history goes throughout the time. And if these verses are being applying to now, it's almost as if Jesus is saying, if you take that view, Jesus is saying, but don't be alarmed by these things. Actually, don't be alarmed by these things, and don't go chasing after these things to evidence that he's about to come back. There's that kind of thing going on there. Jesus is saying, you will hear of all these things, but don't be alarmed. Although they are alarming. If you turn on and you see there's another war happening, and there's another, what some would call climate disaster, whatever it might be, there's another thing happening. Jesus says, these things are going to come. These things are going to come, but don't be alarmed. Don't be alarmed. The time is not yet. This is what happens. It's what happens in the world. It's the part of living under the curse of the fall in a fallen world and a fallen creation. But there are warnings here for us too, aren't they? Don't listen to the false prophets. Don't listen to the false messiahs. Stay rooted and grounded in God's word. Do not be alarmed when you hear all these things happening and think, oh my gosh, what is going on? Because we're so prone even now to be alarmed, aren't we? To turn on the news and kind of, woe is me, even as the church. And it's right that we should grieve and lament and help and not be passive. I don't mean any of that. But that ultimately we're not alarmed because we know, Jesus said this would happen. This would happen. This would happen. And he will come again. We know what's happening. So he warns them almost, don't go looking after all that stuff because that's going to happen. That will happen. But he is going to warn them about this time that will come. We'll see down that in verse 14 onwards. Verse 9 takes us into something else. Having warned about all these things that will happen, he also speaks of persecution. Before this time happens, this is what you're going to face. Again, he's speaking to them. But be on your guard, verse 9. For they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them. And you go straight into Acts, don't you? And what do you see happening to the very men that he is speaking to in this moment? They're brought before councils. They're brought before synagogues. They have to testify and speak to these authorities, as would the apostles, as ultimately would his church. Straight away that happens. What a comfort for these men to know when they're standing before and they're being beaten for preaching the resurrection. I wonder if these words of Jesus just echoed in their minds. Be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils. And so remember that this is coming. This is coming. You will face it. Sort of be ready for that. That's not an easy thing to be told, but there was a comfort in them knowing Jesus knew this was coming. It's not out of his control. It's not out with what he can do, what he can deal with. That's good. That's a wonderful truth for God's people. And we come and we pick up our cross and follow Jesus. He doesn't promise ease. He doesn't promise comfort. But he does say, I know what's coming. He knows what's coming for each of us. He knows what's coming for you tomorrow. And if suffering is ahead, if difficulty is ahead, he knows it's there. It's like, it's just he knows it's coming and he'll be with you. And he'll be present with you and help you endure. This is what he said to those people. And I think of our persecuted brothers and sisters around the world, for them to know this, to know that the Lord is with them and that they face persecution and but he is there. But he says this will come before that time. So what do we make of verse 10? If that's true, then where does this verse 10 fit? If what I'm saying is true, where would that fit within the time when the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations? I suppose if you're seeing this as speaking about the return of Christ, you would say, well, that the gospel first goes to all the nations as kind of as we think of them today. Of course, what I'm saying is that Jesus is primarily speaking to them in their day and saying, the gospel must, so how does that fit then? How does that work? Well, it's important to know that often in the Bible, when Jesus is talking about, in the New Testament, when we talk about the gospel going to all nations or to the world or to that kind of thing, it can sometimes mean the broader sense, but often it's speaking to the known Roman world at the time. For example, if you put your nativity hat on just for a moment and go with me to Luke 2, when Quirinius, the governor of Syria, sent a decree that the whole world ought to be registered. And so that drove Mary and Joseph back to Bethlehem. Now, that guy didn't have power over the whole globe. He didn't have power over the whole world. He couldn't have been telling people whoever used to live in Canada at that time, you need to go back and register. So he was referring to the known world, the people which he had authority over. We also read in passages like Colossians when Paul talks about the gospel spreading across he talks about already the gospel. This is why I needed my notes. Colossians 1, where he talks about the world spread, the gospel bearing fruit across the whole world. Well, the gospel hadn't got to the whole world yet. So what does he mean by the whole world? And there's a similar thing said in Romans as well. And even that famine that we spoke of, the famine only went across the Roman Empire, but in Acts 11 it says the whole world. So it's possible that what Jesus is reminding them of is the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations, in the sense that it's going out to the Gentiles. It's reaching the Gentiles across the Roman Empire. It's also interesting that at Pentecost, I've always find that a fascinating little phrase. Acts chapter 2 verse 5 says that at that time in Jerusalem was gathered every nation under heaven. So if we're taking a kind of 21st century Western, like looking at my globe and going, were they all there? Well, no, they can't have all been there. That wasn't. So he's probably talking about the known people throughout the Roman Empire. But the Gentiles getting the gospel to them. And make no mistake, I don't want to in any way downplay the need to get the gospel to all people and all nations. Or even as we talk today, not just nations, we talk about people groups. Because within nations, you've got little people groups that have their own language, their own culture, their own thing. We want to get the gospel and the Bible to all those people and make our best effort to get the gospel to all peoples. And so perhaps what's going on here is the gospel is being proclaimed to the Gentiles. It's going to be on Israel and to other peoples. And as they do that together, verse 11, they will bring you to trial and deliver you over. Do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. This is a moment as they face persecution for preaching the gospel, as they preach the gospel, as they talk and effectively defy the authorities. It said, do not be anxious. What a thing to be told when you're facing this. Do not be anxious. It's like what Brian was just saying in his prayers there. Jesus doesn't ask us to be anxious. He doesn't tell us we need to be anxious. He says, don't worry about that. Do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given you in that hour. Jesus would provide for them. The Lord would provide for them in their moment of need, in their moment of persecution, in their moment of difficulty. It is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. It's wonderful that we have the Spirit dwelling within us, and that they would have the Spirit dwelling within them at that time. And you saw that difference in these men, didn't you, in Acts, when they filled with God's Spirit and they speak the truth of his word and in boldness and with authority, and the impact that has on people. And as they stand face to face with these men, and they say things like, decide for yourself, is it better to listen to you or to God? These guys were blown away singing. It actually says that, doesn't it? They saw that they had been with Jesus. They're common, uneducated men. They saw that they had been with Jesus. There was a power in them. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. This was the impact of the gospel. Jesus said at times, didn't he? I did not come to bring peace but division. Father will turn against father, brother against mother. Biological family will turn against other. You'll have your spiritual family, but people will turn each other over. Jesus himself knew for a time what it was to be rejected by his own family, didn't he? They say he's crazy, he's out of his mind. Remember, there's that bit where he's teaching people and his family are saying, We want to see him. We want to see him. And he says, who is my brother, sister, mother, father? He who does the will of God. In that moment, there was a strong point there. If they reject you, it's because they reject Christ. They reject him. You're part of his family. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. As they go and as they preach and as they receive hatred. And Jesus said, no, if they hated you, they hated me first. It's because of me that they hate you, but it's worth it. It is so worth it. Because the one who is truly saved endures. And will, at the end, it will be worth it. Even if you face martyrdom and death, that just sends you into glory, into the presence of Jesus. So there's this kind of warning against what is to come in that time, which naturally applies to the church throughout the ages. You'll see signs, you'll suffer, there'll be falsehood, there'll be all kinds of things going on around the world. Do not be alarmed. Be on your guard, be vigilant, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, keep your ears listening to him in his word. And then he moves into something else, into verse 14 and onwards. Where he speaks about this time, and again, this is one of these things where there's all kinds of views and perspective. Verse 14, he speaks about what I think is speaking about the events of AD sort of 66, 70, that time where the city of Jerusalem would come under attack and be sieged at the rebellion. We read that in verse 14, it says, when you see the abomination of desolation, so moving on from there, verse 14, but when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So it seems what he's doing here is there's a time where he says you're going to be dragged before counselors and people and you are going to be persecuted. But at that time there's a call to endurance. But now he's talking about a time when you're called to flee, you're called to run. Seems that there is a time occasionally. I mean, Paul got lowered out of a basket, out of a wall, didn't he? And he writes about that as one of his when he's listing off his weaknesses. He's obviously a little embarrassed about being lowered out of a basket. He says that wasn't my finest moment. There may be times to run, but largely he's calling them to endure and to continue to preach regardless of what comes. But in this moment, he's not really speaking. He doesn't say you. So who's he talking to? Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. There's this event. This time would be a time to run, to flee, get out the city. Not be near it when this happens. And you see the abomination of desolation. This is a phrase that crops up in Daniel several times in one way or another. And probably the ones who have read Daniel, let the reader understand, are thinking of how one of those was fulfilled with Antiochus Epiphanes. I think that's how you say his name. Again, wish I had my notes. But he took his armies, went to the temple, did all kinds of sacrilege things within the temple, offered up a sacrifice himself and sort of declared himself God in that place. And it was a time of carnage, basically. And the disciples hearing this are going, is there going to be another one of those guys? It's going to be another one of them coming. And Jesus is saying, yes, that's what's going to happen. Where he ought not to be, let the reader understand when that comes. Now, what happened around the events of AD 70 was when the Roman armies came into Jerusalem, the Roman army commander Titus went to the temple, set himself up. I believe he offered a pig, of all things, as a sacrifice in the temple, as his soldiers kind of proclaimed his name and effectively were declaring him a god. Abomination of desolation, standing where he ought not to be. So this is more than just an act. This is an act done by someone in particular, desecrating something holy, doing something that is wicked and is vile. When you see this person coming, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So what's happening here is very much in a geographical kind of area. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out. When I was reading these verses, it reminded me, I don't know if you got those at school, but those like fire safety videos that left you terrified for months. They'll show you these. I remember being awake for months after that because they say here's all the ways your house can go on fire when you're sleeping, basically. And I was like 7 or 8. And so here's what not to do when a fire happens. My parents had to counsel me through that. So did a lot of my classmates. So I'm going to die in my sleep when my house goes on fire. But it told you all the things that you shouldn't do. And there was always the video of this daft woman who would say, oh, it's all right, I'll just go up and get the jewellery, kind of thing, as the kitchen is blazing on fire. And and there'll be a big cross sign. Do not do this when your house is on fire. Don't run up and get the valuables. Don't run up and get this. Don't run up and get that. And Jesus is giving them sort of this kind of warning. You don't want to hang about when this happens, because it's going to be horrific. You don't want to do that. Take anything out. Like the one who's on the housetop, pretty cool. Apparently in the day, the housetops were pretty flat, and that actually helped create a way out of the city, just nipping over the housetop. So if you're on the housetop, just keep going. Nor enter his house to take anything out. Like the one who is in the field, not turn back to take his cloak. Alas for women who are pregnant. Obviously, I've never been pregnant, but I imagine trying to get anywhere quickly, as I know, having had 3 children, that's going to be difficult. Alas for women who are pregnant, for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not happen in winter, which makes life more difficult. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, and never will be. The events of AD sort of 66 to 70 and what happened in the city. If you're feeling emotionally fragile, do not read what happened in the city at that time. It was horrific. I read it on the wrong day the other week and thought, I need to go and do something else. What is horrific as the city was kind of closed off and being sieged, the starvation, the famine. I believe once they started killing them all, I think that something was said, Josephus said something, they crucified so many people that they ran out of wood. So many Jews were crucified that day. There's just the events of what happened in the city were absolutely horrific. Josephus tries to tell us that 1.1 million people were massacred. They reckon that might be overstated as what happened. Another 100,000 were carried off as slaves as this rebellion continued. But the details are pretty, the disease and the terrible time that happened. So there was great tribulation in that sense. It was a horrific time. I wondered, well, could we really say, as horrific and awful as that was, that there has not been, that there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the world? Is that the worst thing that has ever happened in the whole of creation until now, and never will be? We don't know the full extent of it. It was certainly horrific in a very condensed space and time. But often the Bible speaks in this way of kind of, when we read in Exodus 11 about how the firstborn was killed, and it says something, there was a cry from Egypt that day that will never heard before and will never be heard again. In 2 Kings we read of an interesting thing that puzzled me when I read it, and then realized, oh, he's making a point. And King Hezekiah was described as the king who loved the Lord and he followed his ways as no king had before, and no king would ever after. And then Josiah came. And then it said the same thing about Josiah. So it said that he was this king who loved the Lord and followed his word more than any king before him and more than any king would after. The Bible is not contradicting itself. It's just that there's a hyperbole that comes sometimes in order to describe a situation or to describe what something, either the goodness of a king, the holiness of a king, or the horror of a situation that happens. And so we should see that as we read through the Bible. If the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. This may well be referring to the Christians at that time who were either in the city or had not managed to escape, but the Lord in this moment had saved his people from this particular judgment, this particular destruction. Interestingly, this is the great thing about reading church history alongside some of these events. You see that that around when they came to the gates, when this all began to kick off, a large portion, at least if not almost all of the Christians in the city fled. They left the city and they went up on a hill. They were led out. And what happened, it was almost like they were seeing what was happening and saying, this is it, go. And they left the city and got out in time. And weirdly, this is the Roman commander, I think it was Vespasian anyway, he has a name, he commanded inexplicably, for the Roman armies to withdraw. Everyone, why have they withdrawn? And in that moment, the Christians got out. So there was this Josephus, was he toying with this idea of God maybe just withdrawing the people so that the Christians would escape? But he said, flee, and they fled to the mountains. So if anyone says, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand. This is why Jesus told them these things. I'm gearing you up. I'm preparing you for what's ahead, what's about to come. And there may be in some ways a projection into there. We read in 2 Thessalonians 2, don't we, about sort of the man of lawlessness who comes and sets himself up in the temple of God and proclaims him a God. It's almost, this might be a microcosm of what's to come. Or the Antichrist we read about in 1 John 2. Also that there's many antichrists that have gone out. It is the last hour, John says. It's the last days from Pentecostal till the end. And in my views, there's a ton of antichrists running around. There's that one that's going to come just before the end. So there could be like a projecting forward. But primarily, I believe he's talking to these men. And he's preparing them for what they will face. Some of that will be persecution. Some of that will be cataclysmic events happening around, catastrophic events, things, horrible things happening. Some of it will be false teachers trying to lead you astray and teach you what is false. And a whole host of difficulty and challenge and sadness and pain even. But what does Jesus say? Be on your guard. Be prepared for it. I know it's coming. And do not be alarmed, because Jesus knows it's coming. I've told you beforehand. And so all you have to do is remain vigilant, remain focused on me, listen to my word, obey my commands. Don't be led astray by what is false. And do not be alarmed, because God is in control. All we have to do is fix our eyes on Jesus, as we thought about our communion, and listen to his word. In the chaos of life, in the difficulty in the world that is around us, we just keep our eyes fixed on him. Do not be alarmed, be at peace, because we know what's happening. Or at least Jesus knows what's happening. And he's told us beforehand. Let's pray together.